I'll ring her back. Oh, she's on voicemail as well. I'll try her on number. Hi, you all right? Did you ring? Yeah, fine. Yeah, we're just setting up the YouTube, and then we've got some people waiting in the lobby, so we'll let them in shortly. No, I mean, it's just cold, but there's nothing here at all, really. There's a little bit of snow on the grass, but no, it's fine. It's a bit very foggy, though. But to be honest, the car park was fine. It wasn't... Oh, right. Okay. I need to hang up because we need the meeting room. Sorry. Oh, yeah, you're live on YouTube. Sorry. Okay, bye. What time is it? All right, okay. I'll just shut that down. So I'll start letting them in.
You've muted your call.
Okay. Morning, members. If I could just remind you that it is actually live on YouTube now, so if you can put your microphones on mute, please. It is a delay, isn't it?
Good morning, members and officers. It's Kath. Happy New Year to you all.
Thank you, Kath. Happy New Year to you from Belinda.
Hi, Kath. Happy New Year to you.
Morning, Kath. Happy New Year.
And to you, Ian and Andrew. Let's hope it's a better one and that we soon get our injections.
Yes. Morning.
Morning, George.
Hi, Kath.
Morning, William. Andrew, New Year.
Morning, Kath. You too. David, thank you very much. I think we've got success. Brilliant. Thanks for your help. Bye.
Morning, William.
Morning, Happy New Year to you all.
And to you.
Yeah, same to everybody.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy
And
New
to
Year,
you,
Lydia.
Lydia.
Hi, Lydia. Happy New Year to you as well, and everyone else.
Morning, everyone. I hope everyone.
Morning.
Lydia, before we begin, thank you very much for sending me my raffle prize goodies through the post. Much appreciated. And when we find a convenient moment, I'll collect the others, well, in due course. But thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Andrew, and thanks very much for Kath and for everyone who supported it as well. It's very much appreciated.
Yeah, what a really, really good effort all round. So, Kath, Lydia, thank you. Well done.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the planning meeting for January. Can I just check with the ladies at Alden House? Are we all ready to go?
Yes, Chair, we're all ready to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So welcome to everybody. Happy New Year to you. If we can start the meeting by going through, first of all, a roll call of members present and apologies. So apologies have been received from Andrew Gregory, but he may actually join us later. And any members' declarations of interest, I haven't had any for this meeting, but I should declare I've had emails relating to the previous meeting from the Isaacs, which was item 121/20 on the minutes. And John Scott is going to refer to this when we've done the roll call. So if I hand over to Alden House for the roll call, please.
Thank you, Chair. If I can just go down the list of members, and if you could just confirm if you've got any declarations of interest, please. Councillor Armitage.
Hello, no declaration.
Thank you. Councillor Brady.
Here and no declarations.
Thank you. Councillor Chaplin.
Yes, here. Good morning. Declarations of interest on items 6 and 7 because they relate to the Peak District National Park Authority. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Harling.
No declarations other than those already mentioned.
Thank you. Councillor Hart.
Good morning, present. I have obviously declarations on the 2 National Park Authority applications, as I am a National Park member. I've had a phone call from a previous objector to one of the applications from the previous meeting, but I was not present when that application was heard. So therefore, I just want to mention I have had a phone call. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Hurlwell. So, Robert, you're muted.
Hey, apologies. Yes, no further declarations of interest. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Huddleston.
Here, and just the 6 and 7 like everyone else.
Thank you. Councillor McCloy.
Yeah, present, same interest as everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Potter.
Same interest of everyone else.
Thank you. Councillor Richardson.
Present and no interest other than I'm part of Peak Authority as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Slack.
Present and same as everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Present and same declarations as everyone else.
And Councillor Warmby, please.
Present and same declarations as each other one.
Okay. Thank you,
Are you
Chair.
ignoring me, Karen?
Oh, sorry. Councillor Chapman.
Thanks. Obviously present, declarations on the Peak Park ones, and I also had the email that Robert mentioned from the Isaacs, was it? I also, on application number 5, the applicant is a friend of mine, so I declare a personal interest, and obviously the application is within my village.
Okay, thank you very much.
The village, I live there.
Thank you, Chapman.
Andrea.
Sorry, so on that basis, it's a personal and prejudicial interest, Councillor Chapman, I presume, and you'll be leaving the meeting whilst this matter is being considered. Is that correct?
I'll take your advice on that, Andrea, yeah.
Well, yeah, if you've got a personal interest and they're a close associate of yours, that's your call. But if it is, then you'll need to declare a prejudicial interest and leave the room whilst the matter is being considered.
Okay.
Thank you. Right, moving on then to minutes of the previous meeting. Can I hand over to John Scott before we approve these minutes then, please?
Yes, thanks, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Yes, the application on Sherwood Road, Tideswell, which you had at the last meeting from the Isaacs family. I understand you've all had an email this week, I think it was, wasn't it? From the applicants, James and Emma, I think it was. And it was quite a long email. It was raising questions about the discussion at the meeting and about the minutes, and it had some attachments as well. I responded to that earlier in the week, and you'll see what I've suggested is, if I summarise it, the first thing is that our minutes are not a verbatim record of who said what at the meeting. We very consciously do not do that. It's a summary of the presentation and the discussion, and it records the decision. The decision is recorded properly, but the rest is only a summary. So it's important to appreciate that the minutes don't show everything that was said. Second thing is, in that email, they asked us to re-vote on the application, to reconsider it. We can't do that because it was issued on the 15th of December. The meeting was on the 11th, I think, wasn't it? So it was issued the following week, which is our normal practice to issue as soon as we can after the meeting, on the same day sometimes. So it has been issued. So in this case, the applicant has, I guess, 2 or 3 options. They could appeal. If they think the decision is flawed in some way, they could go for some sort of judicial review, or they can have a look at the proposal again. And as you saw in my response, and it's not the first email I've sent them, I think we've been pretty clear. We think the site is the wrong site in terms of its relationship to the village and the historic field pattern. And although there are other issues there, which I think they might be able to overcome, the size of the dwelling, for example, and things like tree surveys, there are some fundamental issues there, and we have been pretty consistent in advising that. Having said that, we think the way forward is we've offered them a further discussion, a further meeting, a virtual meeting. I think it will be in practice, so we can iron out the things we can iron out, and we can get to a point where only those issues which are fundamental issues of principle are left. I know the applicant was concerned. They wanted pre-application advice during the summer, but we had suspended our application service and the pre-app service, sorry. So I've offered the pre-application advice on this occasion without a charge. We'd normally charge, and if they were to resubmit the application, it will be free if it's within 12 months of a refusal. So on that basis, my advice to the applicants is speak to us about a way forward, overcome those things you can overcome, and the things you can't overcome may be left on the table, and we may come back, I guess, with a future application. And if that's refused, they can appeal it, but that's the best way forward. I've advised the applicant to focus on those issues as opposed to a long string of email where they ask questions, often quite closed questions too, which I don't think is helpful. So on that basis, I think you have seen the email which I sent to the applicants. I haven't had a response yet, but I hope you agree that's the best way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So, given that information from John, can we move the minutes of the previous meeting, please? Thank you, Patrick. And second,
Chair, can I just ask for one correction?
Ken, yeah, sorry.
It's relatively minor, but I think it's important. On page 6, 116, the Chatsworth application, the first paragraph, the middle of the second line, refers to an agricultural report. I think it should be arboricultural. And I think it's important that we're correct about which report we are referring to in the minutes.
Yeah, that's right, Patrick. Sorry, Ken. Sorry. Thank you very much for highlighting that. So, Patrick's moved the minutes. Are you happy with those, Patrick? Mike?
Chair, I have a matter on page 26. The application for yeah, it's for the Manege at Manor House Farm. It's the spelling there. It was picked up in the meeting, if I remember right, by Andrew McCloy, but it appears wrongly spelt twice on page 26 and page 27. And I have to say, for me at the time, it did lead to some confusion, which was unnecessary.
Sorry, just clarify which word you're talking about, please, Mike.
Well, the word is spelt M-E-N-A-G-E, and I do not believe that is the correct spelling.
Right.
And it appears again on page 27 against point 5, use of the M-E-N-A-G-E.
Right, okay, thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
If I could respond there, Chair.
John?
Yeah, I wasn't in that part of the meeting, but it's often the case the application comes in with that spelling and we have to use the applicant's wording on the application. And I know this has been a long-standing issue, but I think you find most applications have the spelling you see in the minutes, even though I understand the more correct spelling is the one you just mentioned there, Councillor Chaplin. But we normally have to stick, well, we have to stick with the applicant's description of the application.
Okay. Thank you, John, for that clarification. Right, seconder for the minutes then, please. Thank you, David. Any urgent business? I have no urgent business. Public participation, we have one item from member of the public which relates to item 5, so we'll come to that shortly. And then we will now move on to item 5 then. And this is a full application for a proposed new build dwelling to satisfy a local need at Town End Farm, Main Street, Chelmorton. And the Vice Chair and myself did actually visit this site with officers yesterday in the snow. So over to Mark Nuttall, please, who will take us through this.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, everybody. Just before I start, I do need to correct the report in a couple of places. At both paragraphs 11 and 88, the proposed dwelling is referred to as being a 3-bed dwelling. That's how it was actually originally submitted. It is now a 2-bed dwelling. It has no bearing on the substance or the conclusions of the report, but that should read a 2-bed dwelling. And also at paragraph 14, it says that an application was sorry, bear with me, I'll just get it back up in front of me myself. It says that an application in 2019 was withdrawn prior to submission. Obviously, that's not possible. It should say prior to determination. Okay, so moving on to the application itself, it's a resubmission of a very similar application that was made almost 12 months ago now, but that was withdrawn prior to determination. So I'll just go through the slides in the first instance. So you can see on the slides here, the application is within Chelmorton. It's towards the southern end of the village, and as you can see there, the red line connects to the highway, but the majority of the application site itself is actually set back from the road behind some other residential properties. If we just go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Then you can see there the red line dotted on this site is the space in which the dwelling itself is actually proposed. The vehicular access is marked there, is annotated, and that sort of runs back towards and weaves back towards the application site. The agricultural building that you can see to the north of the red lined area, that's in the applicant's control, and the dwelling to the right of that, as you look at the photo, is the applicant's dwelling where he lives with his daughter, for whom the affordable dwelling is proposed. The other dwelling that's annotated there is the nearest neighbouring property. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the application site where the dwelling is proposed. This has turned through roughly 90 degrees since the last image that you saw. You'll see there that north is sort of almost off to the right of this picture, so the bearings have changed a bit from what you were just looking at. The dotted line that you can see there in this sort of outlines an irregular rectangle shape. That is the position of an existing timber building on the site. It's a timber agricultural building on the site, which you'll see in the photographs as we go through in a moment. And you can see the proposed dwelling is obviously the building that partially overlays that with the sort of blue-grey roof that you can see there. The 2 parking spaces are proposed, and they're dotted immediately to the, as you look at in there, beneath the dwelling, actually to its east. And the hatched area with the sort of the red lines going through it, that's outlined as parking and turning space. Some of that's outside of the application site area, but it's nevertheless in land that's in the applicant's control. The dotted circles on that plan are existing trees, all of which are to be retained, and the development is outside of their root protection areas as well. Okay, so if we can just go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is some photos of the site for context. So this is looking almost west, essentially stood in front of the applicant's dwelling and agricultural building, looking back towards the application site. So you can see the timber agricultural building that I referred to there, just behind that JCB. Next, please. And that's looking almost south then towards the nearest neighbouring dwelling, which you can see has its garden positioned between the application site and the property itself. Next slide, please. And this is looking back towards the applicant's dwelling, which you can see on the right there, and the agricultural building also in their control to the left of the photograph. Next, please. And this is looking north through the site. So you've obviously got the timber building on the left there, and then you're looking out to the field system to the north beyond that, and you can see the trees that are edging the site there as well. Next slide. And this is a site of the access. Sorry, a photo of the site access. This is actually a photograph from Google, because I realised when I got back, for whatever reason, I didn't actually take a photograph of the site access myself. But it's largely unchanged. There is now a hedgerow around the front and side edges of that lawn that you can see there. You can see there's already a hedgerow along the back edge of it. There's now one actually that comes around the front and down the side of the driveway as well. You can see 2 driveways there. The driveway that's actually going to the application site and is included in the red line area is the right-hand one of the 2 that you can see in that picture. Okay, next slide, please. So the dwelling itself, as originally proposed, it's actually been amended. So as originally proposed, it was a larger building and it had a design of agricultural character. The authority's conservation officer raised some concerns about that approach. There's a number of agricultural buildings or former agricultural buildings rather, in very close proximity to this site, and over time they've been converted to dwellings. But the conservation officer was concerned that a building of agricultural appearance would confuse and dilute the historic character of the area and make the archaeology less legible. And as a result, it was redesigned as a more domestic appearance. So you can see now it has the appearance of a fairly simple, traditional local cottage. Next picture, please. Thanks. So there's pictures of both gables, both are blank, as would be traditional. Next slide, please. And that's the rear elevation. Slightly more windows than you might expect, but it still retains a good solid to void relationship, and we're comfortable with that. Next slide, please. And that's just the other blank gable as well. And moving on to the floor plans. Ground floor, you can see it's fairly typical. You've got a living area, a kitchen, and a utility with sort of a lobby serving that and the kitchen, and a hallway in WC. And then if we just move on to the upstairs, we've got 2 bedrooms with a landing and a shared bathroom. So as I say, overall we're comfortable with the design of the property, and it would be acceptable in those regards. There are, however, 3 grounds that you'll have seen in your report that the application is recommended for refusal on. So I'll just go through those now for you. The first one of those relates to the size of the dwelling. The proposed affordable dwelling is the applicant's daughter, who currently lives with him at the property that you saw already in the photographs and on the plans. And she does meet the local occupancy criteria that are set out in planning policy for affordable dwellings. And she's also registered with Home Options, the local housing partnership. And they've confirmed that she does have a housing need, and they've identified that need as being for a 1-person dwelling. So it's local plan policy DMH1 that sets out the size thresholds for new affordable dwellings based on identified need. These range from 39 square metres for a 1-person dwelling up to 97 square metres for a 5-person dwelling. And those sizes are based on national space standards. So the size restrictions are structured in this way to make sure that housing that's provided meets the identified need, and to ensure that there's a range of affordable housing provided under the policy to meet differing needs and differing budgets for affordable housing as well in the longer term. So as I said, in this case, the identified need is for a 1-person dwelling, and that means that in order to comply with policy, the dwelling needs to be no larger than 39 metres squared in terms of its internal floor space. However, in this case, it's actually 76 metres squared, which is larger than policy would support for even a 3-person dwelling. The criteria, incidentally, are set out in full in the policy section of your report. So for this reason, the proposals are contrary to policy DMH1, and that's one of the reasons that the application is recommended for refusal. The second reason that's led to the recommendation is the potential archaeological impacts of it. If we could perhaps just go back to the location plan at the very start, please, that'd be helpful here. That's great, thanks. So Chelmorton, it's a medieval settlement dating back to at least the 12th century. And as you can see, it broadly retains its medieval layout as a ribbon settlement, just running down each side of the road there. And it has the medieval field system extending beyond and behind that built development, which again you can see some of here, and which obviously extends outside of the frame of that image as well. The particular historic significance of this is recognised by the fact that the entire village and all of the surrounding field system are designated as a conservation area. There's not many villages in the national park where that's actually the case. There's normally areas of built development that are excluded, and it's uncommon for large areas of field system to be included as well. And that just goes to underline the historic significance of both the settlement and its relation to the field system beyond it. Unfortunately, the application doesn't include any assessment of the site's archaeological interest at all. The authority's archaeologist was consulted on the application, and they've advised that from our own records there isn't enough information there to make an assessment of the particular site's significance, or indeed of the impacts that the development would have upon that, and that therefore an archaeological assessment does need to be provided. The applicant was advised actually that this would be necessary prior to them withdrawing the previous application, but unfortunately nothing came in with the current one and hasn't been provided during the course of it. The need for applicants to provide adequate heritage information to allow for an informed assessment to be made is set out very clearly in both our own policies and in the MPPF. And for that reason, the absence of the information is a further recommendation, a further reason for the recommendation of refusal. The third and final reason for the recommendation relates to the site access. So if we can perhaps just go back to the photograph of that access, please. Great, thank you. So as I already mentioned, the access that we're talking about here is the right-hand one of the two driveways that you can see there. And the applicant owns that driveway, but doesn't own the land to each side, which is in separate control. The application itself does include an appraisal of the access and visibility from it, which has been undertaken by a professional transportation planning consultancy. And that advises that without taking visibility over land outside of the applicant's control, so essentially taking it from between the walls there rather than sort of cutting it over the walls or across neighbouring gardens. The maximum visibility in each direction when leaving the site in a vehicle to the south is 13 metres and to the north is 25 metres. To meet highway recommendations for safe access, it would need to be 43 metres in each direction. So obviously it's falling well short of that. In addition, the measurements have actually been taken from 2 metres back from the highway edge. Standard practice is to take them from 2.4 metres back, and that's essentially to allow for typical bonnet lengths plus expected seating positions within a vehicle, and how far that would put you back from the highway before you're actually encroaching into it. So if you were to measure it from 2.4 metres back instead of 2 metres back, then those distances would be further reduced as well. So given this situation, the access is already substandard in terms of visibility for the properties that are currently using it, and the Highway Authority object to an increase in the intensity of use of it on the grounds of highway safety. And that's the reason for the final recommendation on the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. There is one speaker who sent in a written statement for this item, and that's Mr. Jonathan Devereux, to be read out by Alden House, please.
This is a statement by Mr. Jonathan Devereux regarding item 5, Town End Farm, Chelmorton. Dear committee members, I write in support of the above application. I would firstly like to say that the application is for only a small 2-bedroom building and not 3 bedrooms as is stated in parts of the officer's report. The building is for a local need for my daughter who's 22 years old and who meets the District Council's criteria for local need. The report to committee recommends certain sizes of dwellings and classifies my daughter as only requiring 39 square metres. It seems nonsensical to build a detached stone dwelling this small. My daughter's circumstances could change quite quickly, where she would have a partner to share her home and possibly become pregnant. With regard to the archaeological assessment, we've been carrying out building works on the farmstead since 2006 and have not been asked for such a report for any of our previous planning applications. There has been nothing to suggest anything of archaeological interest during our works, and to be asked to find a further £2,000 for the assessment with no guarantee of a consent seems to be quite unreasonable. A watching brief by condition during digging work would be a much fairer way of dealing with this issue. Finally, may I say that when committee view the road access, I hope they will see that it is not dangerous nor compromised as the report seems to suggest. The Parish Council have not raised the access as an issue, and we have commissioned an independent professional report on the access included with our application, which disagrees with the Highways opinion. Its safe usability is quite obvious to us as we use it every day. I hope the committee will appreciate the proposed small local needs cottage to be located in the top corner of our farmyard will satisfy a much needed demand and have a negligible impact from all points of view. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So now it's over to members for any questions and any comments, please. So Patrick, you're going to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Oh gosh, these sorts of things are so difficult. I visited the site yesterday myself, having read the report 2 or 3 times, to assess the access issue. Sitting here in my office at the moment, I look up my lane and I see the tail end of somewhere called Fold Farm in Taddington, which we granted 5 houses on, with an access far, far worse than this one. And my experience of going to Chelmorton yesterday was that whatever the theories are about distance and sight lines and everything else, this access was perfectly safe and an awful lot safer than some of the other accesses that you get up and down the street in Chelmorton. And I was able to, I mean, one of the things that one has to bear in mind, which doesn't happen here, for example, at Fold Farm, is that there's a substantial pavement, which we could see on that picture that we were shown. I was able to sit in my car and watch a car coming up from Chelmorton Ditch Road, right from the junction. I had to move my car because it turned out that they were driving into the place where I was parking. If traffic was the only issue, I think we would have some difficulty in refusing it on that ground. And I think if we had had site visits, quite a few of the members would have been somewhat askance at this as being a serious reason for refusal. It is interesting when you go back through the old planning applications. The previous one we had was for the barn that we saw in those photographs. As you saw, there was horse boxes and other things there because I believe the family are interested in horses and so on and so forth. The Highway Authority raised not an eyebrow about that application. It just said no objection, should be ancillary to the main house. Go back a stage further when the barn conversions came up, no objection, no objection. And then suddenly here we are in 2001, and we need big, long sight lines and all sorts of things. I don't get it. And I don't believe that that reason for refusal is sustainable. Moving on to the archaeology. I've been on this committee now for 8 years. And time after time after time after time, we grant a planning permission with a condition saying an archaeological report will be done before development is commenced. The only 2 times that I have come across a situation where we have said the archaeological report has to be done first. One of them was for the affordable house at Town End in Taddington. And the other one is this. Now, Chairman, what we can't do, particularly when you're talking about affordable houses, and the operative word is affordable, people who want an affordable house don't have a lot of money. What we can't do is to use planning applications as a fishing expedition to find out whether there are archaeological remains there. If we are going to say we need a proper archaeological report, it must be because we know that somewhere on that site there is some real important archaeological things to be addressed, and they must be looked at before we grant a planning permission. Now, there is nothing in this report that suggests to me that we have that information. And if you look very carefully at what the report says, it's in paragraph 28, it says the reason it gives for this very unusual planning condition is that the site is located in the historic core of the village. It isn't. If you read the conservation area report, it says what we would all know. The historic core of the village is at the top end, where the church and the pub and everything is. This is much further down, and if you look round where you're standing here, a lot of the development is 19th and 20th century. The only really old house is Town End Farm itself, which dates from 1634. So we really must not use our powers to try and force people to gorge up archaeological reports because we just fancy the idea that we'd like to know whether there's something there or not. We have to have some evidence first. And that evidence is not in this report if it exists anywhere at all. So I don't give any credence to that as a reason for refusal. Which brings us back to the first reason for refusal, which is the size. Now, I have the report is quite right in saying that if you're going to build a 2-bedroomed house, this house is too big. If you're going to build a 3-bedroomed house, it is probably still too big. But what this report is doing is actually saying something else. And that something else is not actually in the policy, and it's not in the explanation for the policy. What this report is saying is because this young woman is single and on her own, she can only have a 1-bedroomed house. Chairman, we have a vision about thriving and vibrant villages. The idea that we, in that sort of way, control the way people live is just unacceptable. This young, as the speaker said when he was addressing us just now, her circumstances will change. She may end up married, she may have a child, she may want granny to come and stay. It is not an unreasonable thing for a single woman on her own to have a 2-bedroomed house. It really is not. The blurb in our policy document talks about meeting a need. We've had this discussion several times on this committee. Need is a relative word. I might need a glass of water now because I'm a bit thirsty. I might need an oasis if I'm stuck in the Sahara Desert and my water flask has turned emptied and I've got no water. Both needs, but one of them is a reasonable need and the other one's a desperate need. We're not dealing here in desperate needs. We're talking about reasonable needs. And it really is not an unreasonable thing for this woman to have a house with 2 bedrooms in it. And there's nothing in any of our policies which stop that. So, Chairman, my proposal is that this application be deferred to enable it to go back for the size of the house to be addressed, so that this application might be approved.
Thank you, Patrick. John, can I come on to you, John Scott, and just ask about the archaeological report that Patrick highlighted about?
Yeah, certainly. If you look at the report on the agenda, I'm just trying to find it, sorry. I've just been looking at the words which you used there. It's important to understand that, I suppose, that we don't always know what's on site, and we won't know until some work has been done. In many ways, I think maybe Patrick's point there is that we should only ask for archaeological work to be done if we know there's something which is worth investigating. I take the point that we shouldn't ask for it on sites where it's highly unlikely, because I think that's unreasonable. But as it says in the report, there is evidence 60 metres away of archaeological interest. So I think it's reasonable in a case like this, around an historic settlement, and I accept the core maybe further up the road. I think it's reasonable in the circumstances of what we know now to ask for more survey work, because is it a probability or a possibility that on this site there could be things of interest. I don't think it's a completely blank sheet. We know this place is of interest, and we know somewhere nearby is of interest. And the approach we're taking, it has changed since the applications in the 2000s, because the NPPF raised the bar in 2012 in terms of the need to carry out archaeological investigations and have a much better understanding of the history of an area and of a site. So those applications back in the noughties, I guess they were, had a higher bar to reach. So the approach we're taking, I think, is reasonable. It is proportionate, And unless we have that work done up front, we don't know whether it's going to cause harm. If we approve something and we discover that actually the site's of more significant archaeological interest, it's difficult to go back on that. The process these days is the archaeological work has to be done up front. It needs to be proportionate to what the proposal is. And I actually emailed the applicant. He asked me some time ago for my advice on this. And I said then, I think this is reasonable in these circumstances. Thank you.
Chairman, can I come back on that?
Yeah, yes, Patrick. I've got Kath with a hand up. I've noted you, and Ken also wants to speak. Yeah. Over to you, Patrick. And William, thank you.
Right. What the NPPF says is that planning authorities should require an applicant to describe the significance of any heritage assets affected. It doesn't say that they have to go around searching to find out whether there's a heritage asset there in the first place. And if you, what this is a sort of fishing expedition. Oh yes, there might be something there, there might not. I mean, a young applicant in Taddington had the same problem. He had to spend £1,000 to prove what everybody else said was it was nothing there. It is not reasonable. What is particularly interesting here is that all those circumstances were known 5 years ago. And yet right next door to this site, on the same piece of land, in the same ownership, within the same field system, a substantial wooden barn has been built with a concrete foundation. Nobody was asking for expensive archaeological researches to be done then. I think what's happening here is we're trying to use planning applicants as a cheap way to find out whether there's any archaeology there. If there was serious evidence of archaeology, what's being asked here might be reasonable. But it's not. It's a complete fishing expedition. It's not reasonable.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to go to Ken now, please. And I've got Kath and William in queue. So Ken Smith, please.
Thanks, Chair. A number of issues have inevitably been raised. I think if I can first address the issue of the access, I think it's particularly unfortunate that we haven't got an illustration of what the access looks like now, because I think while Mark has quite reasonably tried to show where and how the access appears, what isn't apparent is that since that Google photograph was taken, there's a significant hedge now on the right-hand side, inside the garden of the property. And it's taller than me. It's over 2 meters high. It's evergreen, and it runs all the way down the drive and all the way along the frontage of that property, which means that the only way that a driver in a vehicle exiting that drive can see what's coming down the road is by being out on the pavement, I would suggest. On the other side, the wall where the for sale sign was positioned, there's about 1 meter of that has gone. But because it's not in the control of the applicant, that could be rebuilt at any time. I think that if we just took that photograph illustration that was used, without the hedgerow, it does look as if it's completely unreasonable. But I think what's important about this, Chair, is that it's the advice of the Highways Authority, almost to an extent, regardless of what we might think. There's been innumerable occasions in the past where we have said, well, we don't see any highway problem, but the advice from the Highway Authority is that there is, and it should, these particular recommendations need to be followed. And we followed them because it's the Highway Authority, and we aren't the Highway Authority. Now, regardless, I would suggest, of what we think about the Highway Authority's advice, we have to take note of it, significant note. In the same way, in a completely different scenario, at December's meeting, we were in a position where we had to take note of what the environmental health officer said about the grills on the takeaway property in Bakewell. We might not have thought it was appropriate, but we felt it wasn't appropriate to go against that advice. And I think we actually lay ourselves open to judicial review or whatever if we go against that advice when we don't have any evidence to base going against that advice on. So I think this is a really important issue that we've got to bear in mind. I think on the archaeological side, I think I think there's a lot of misleading going on here. It is absurd, frankly, with all due respect to Patrick, to suggest that this is only the second occasion that we've asked for a condition to be applied that applies before the works are undertaken. Have a look at condition 8 of Old Stanton Old Hall that we dealt with in the last committee. It specifically says and refers to works that need to be undertaken before the works start. It's an absolutely standard procedure to ensure that whatever is deemed to be appropriate takes place before any groundworks or other activities take place. So I think there is a misunderstanding of what that condition is about. It's absolutely standard. It's the kind of thing that's been in place since 1990, since Planning Policy Guidance Document 16. It's 31 years. It's been incorporated into national advice as to what's a material consideration, and it's been in our policies and has been a standard requirement in order to ensure that committee, in making its decisions, is as fully informed as possible. And one of the things is where there is a probability or possibility even of there being something of archaeological interest, a heritage asset, in an area of development, then there's a staged approach. And it starts with a desk-based assessment, assessing what might be there. On the basis of that desk-based assessment, there's then a further assessment as to whether groundworks are required, excavation. And then there's an assessment of what, if anything, needs to be mitigated as part of the development proposal. And if that interest can't be mitigated, then the archaeological recommendation would probably be that the application should be refused. It's a staged process, and yes, it costs, but it applies to every application that is that has any chance of archaeological interest across the country. It's not just us. It is, I think, disrespectful of officers to suggest that it's a fishing exercise. That's absurd. I think if I may, Chair, finish on the size relationships. One of the things that goes into the assessment, in my understanding, of whether it's a one-person dwelling, a two-person dwelling, or a three-person need from an affordability perspective, is the evidence submitted by the applicant, not to us, but to someone else, to the housing enabler or whoever, who makes their own assessment of what the requirements are and tells us what we should be considering. We aren't judge and jury. We have to seek to provide for a range of provision for people with differing affordability requirements. And it isn't appropriate to suggest, I would suggest, it isn't appropriate to try to second guess what an applicant's circumstances might be in a week, in a year, or in a decade. They might have 6 children ultimately. They might want a small mansion, but that's not what the current request is for, or the current requirement has been assessed as being. The current requirement has been assessed for a one-person provision, and we have to have criteria in order to be able to make that provision. Else, otherwise, what is the point of having policies and seeking to address the differing affordability requirements of residents of the national park? In order to have those requirements, the best way forward is deemed to be on an area basis. We have approved these policies. The Secretary of State has approved these policies. We're being asked to approve something that is double, bar 2 square meters, the criteria that we have in place and that we've applied to other people. If we ignore these policies now, what is going to be the reaction of people who have had their permissions granted on the basis of those criteria? And what's going to be the reaction of people in the future? The precedent that we might be setting, I think, has enormous implications. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ken. Mark, you had your hand up. Do you want to come back onto that? And Kath, I've still got you on the list, and William. Mark Nuttall seems to have disappeared. We'll come back to Mark later on then. Kath, would you like to speak?
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry, but I have to disagree with what Ken's been saying. Good number of years ago, Rothley Parish Council won the first Blue Plaque Award in Derbyshire for Paxton's work, both at Rothley, Chatsworth and other places in Derbyshire. I was very concerned when we went for the RHS application there, which gained approval, and we were told that there could be things underground, but they were never excavated to my knowledge. And I think if we can do it for one person, it's got to be fair and honourable, and I find this disproportionate what's happening. I'm unhappy with the Highway Authority. Only last month, a lane that has 3 chicanes, and I was nearly killed on some years ago, there were complete variation to what they've put here. So I'm sorry, I just find there's something wrong somewhere, that things are so in one thing they approve, another they're not. It's just not right. We should be we can't be disproportionate. We've got to treat everyone the same, and I feel this is being disproportionate, so I can't vote for refusal. I would welcome it coming back and seeing if there's anything else we could do to improve the situation, but I can't vote for refusal. Thank you.
Thank you, Kath. Mark, I see you've rejoined us. Would you like to, you wanted to comment earlier on?
Yeah, sorry, Robert. I'm just having some connection issues, so I'm hoping those don't last, given that I'm presenting the next 2 items as well, but it seems okay at the moment. Yeah, I obviously missed a little bit of the discussion there, so I don't know if this came back in any of Ken's comment, but it was really just to revisit the MPPF that John had referred to, and also Patrick. Just to be clear that at paragraph 189, the wording reads, where a site on which development is proposed includes or has the potential to include heritage assets with archaeological interest, local planning authorities should require developers to submit an appropriate desk-based assessment and, where necessary, a field evaluation. That's what the full comments of our archaeologists are of some length on this because of the potential level of interest, but that is what they're asking for in the first instance. It is that desk-based assessment. It might be that provides sufficient information for them to be able to say that actually, yes, a scheme of archaeology can be dealt with by condition here that mitigates the harm that would arise. But without that desk-based assessment and potentially further investigation, depending on what that shows, we can't understand the level of harm that development would result in. And that's why it has to be a recommendation of refusal and can't be something that's done by condition.
Thank you, Mark. William.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I agree with what Patrick said. As regards the entrance, there's already an entrance there. You know, I mean, if you're going to refuse it on that, what you're going to do, make the owner of that entrance block it up. I also understood that if there is an existing entrance there, then that can be used, and as there is here. Okay, they might have a big hedge taller than Ken, but if it goes above a certain height, there are rules and regulations whereby they have to cut it down or cut it back, and this could be one where it's needed. Yes, we've got the size. That could be a problem, but I'm sure it could be whittled down. But you're assuming that somebody is going to, you know, live on their own for the rest of their lives. Well, I can't see that that happening, and we've got to give young people a chance to live in the Peak Park, because otherwise you're going to end up with a population of elderly people. It may be very easy or very convenient for giving COVID injections and what have you, but not on this occasion. And I think we've got to be consistent as regards the looking at for doing the architectural survey. You didn't ask for it for the agricultural building, which in my mind looks good bit bigger than what they're asking for. So I think, yes, let them have a look at it and let it come back to us, and we can decide then when we've got the facts in front of us. Instead of trying to stifle a young person's ambition to stay in the village, let's try and help them to stay in the village.
Thank you, William. I've got John Scott and Andrew McCloy wanting to speak. John, do you want to come back on a point there?
Yeah, it's actually back to, well, it's back to Patrick and to one or two other speakers too. It's worth bearing in mind the application for the agricultural building was refused by the authority and was allowed on appeal. And although we didn't ask for any agricultural I made a mistake we made earlier, an archaeological assessment, we did express concern. And if I remember correctly, Patrick, I think you made this point too at the meeting, about the impact of the building on the historic field pattern, which is almost a piece of archaeology itself, isn't it? The Chelmorton field pattern is probably the best in the national park. It's had a lot of work on over the years, a lot of survey work and research work by a guy called Jonathan Wager. So even with the agricultural building, we had concerns about the impact on the historic interest of the village. I don't know why we didn't ask for an archaeological assessment. Maybe it's because it was a modern agricultural building with more minimal impact on the ground. But we certainly had concerns about the impact of the building itself on the historic field pattern, but we lost the appeal on that one. Thank you.
I think I have to come back to you on that. Yes, you lost the appeal. And no doubt we could have had costs awarded against the authority, costs which can't afford at this moment in time. It was looked at by an independent inspector and it was passed, and the appeal was upheld. So, you know, that's my point. Let's have a look at it from somebody else. I mean, if they take this to appeal, they could quite easily get it through on the similar grounds.
Yeah. Andrew McCloy.
Chair, thank you. I too have sympathy with the applicant and with this application, and I too would like to help more young people establish their own homes, succession planning, all the things that we want to happen in the national park. However, we have to deal with the application before us and what's presented before us, and the facts are that the property put forward is significantly larger than the size threshold allows. The threshold for one person is 39, two person 58. This is 76. So there is a size issue here which has to be addressed. It is too big even for allowing for growth and for succession planning. On the other 2 points, if it was just archaeology, if that was the key reason, then I think there's room here to move and to be more flexible, but respect the fact that Chelmorton is an historic village. There is archaeological interest, and we do have clear guidelines in place. However, there is also access, and we can't be double standard when it comes to highways advice. We can't just pick and choose when we want to, whether we agree with their advice or we don't agree with their advice. Their advice is standing, and it is very clear here. So I'm afraid, as much as I sympathise with the applicant and I want to pass this application, I can't do in its present form. There are 3 compelling reasons for refusal, and if we do refuse this, the message goes back to the applicant that one is certainly immediately within their gift to look at the size of the dwelling. The second is within their gift to consider an archaeological appraisal and to move forward there. And the third, over access, will likely require some more imaginative thinking involving neighbouring properties. And maybe thinking outside the box. So there is a way forward, but dealing with what we've got here before us, in my opinion, it's not passable, and I'm going to move refusal. I think the officer has got this right.
Thank you, Andrew. Patrick, you had your hand up again. Do you want to come back on something quickly?
Chairman, on this size thing, Ken makes the point that to do what I was suggesting would set a precedent. But that precedent has already been set, and it's been set 2 or 3 times over. I mean, I can see from my window here an affordable house with 3 bedrooms in it. The planning permission was granted to a young man of about 28 living on his own. The house at the bottom end of Taddington that we approved about 3 years ago, a young couple with 1 child, a 3-bedroomed house. It is unreasonable. I understand the point about a variety of housing and the importance of a variety of housing, particularly in the larger settlements like Bakewell and Tideswell and so on and so forth. But in a small village like this, providing a single 1-bedroomed house is not going to add very much to the stock of the house in the village at all. And all it's going to mean is that the young person that moves in there, in a year or 2's time, is going to have to leave again. Because by the nature of things, family life develops. And it is unreasonable to say as a single person applying for the house on their own can only have a single bedroom. It doesn't achieve anything. All it does is to create a demand for other affordable houses with more bedrooms somewhere else, because this one is not the right size. It's a silly policy. If that's the way you interpret it. If you interpret it intelligently and sensibly, which is what we have done so far, then it makes sense. I'm not querying the policy, at least I could query the policy, but I'm not arguing about the policy. I'm arguing about the way it's interpreted. And it's not being interpreted consistently.
Brian, would you like to come back?
Can I make another point? Sorry.
Well, quickly, Patrick.
About the archaeological one, there is not a word in this report other than the assertion that the site has a potential to tell me why the site has a real potential that justifies demanding a significant, expensive report from someone. If we're going to demand that sort of report, then you've got to produce some level of evidence to support it.
Thank you, Patrick. Brian.
Thanks very much. Okay, so just one thing. I mean, going back to earlier commissions, it's obviously what we look at in terms of planning history, but the policies were adopted in May 2019, and that represents a change in some respects. It represents a strengthening in this relationship between need and size, and that's based on the practice that we've got of working together with the housing authorities, understanding the need and understanding the needs of the people out there. So, I mean, this idea of creating stock that, tries as much as possible to get stock at the smaller end as well, because they're more likely to be affordable in the future, is really important. So we have to recognise that these are policies and you can't just compare to earlier commissions. That's one point. Second point is that we already know there's some significance to this site because it's in a conservation area. A conservation area is already a designated heritage asset. So there's some sense that there's some significance there. And we already know things about this importance of the strip fields and the character of Chelmorton. So we're not completely unaware of these issues in terms of heritage. It's really about getting that sense of the significance of the site. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Ken and Lydia have both got their hands up, so we'll go to Ken first, please.
Yeah, just for Patrick's benefit, Chair, I refer him to paragraphs 28 through 31 of the report, which explains where the proximity of the archaeological interest is, what it comprises, and what the reason is for the expectation that there should be at least a starting desk-based assessment for these works. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Lydia.
Yeah, just a quick one about the size of the dwelling. We're in a very different environment to the one we were in 2019, with a lot of young people now working from home. So in my house, if I had to work from home and I didn't have an extra room, I'd really struggle. And I just thought that's something we should be thinking about. And I won't be able to vote for refusal just because I'm finding it all too muddled, and I really feel like we need to be supporting young people and to be able to stay and grow within the community. And I think it's sort of a bit short-sighted to apply this policy of size so rigorously to a person of this age who has the opportunity to develop into the village.
Thank you. I'm looking to draw this to a conclusion. William, you've got your hand up again. Do you want to speak now?
Yeah, it was just if this was an application just for a house and not an affordable, so the size thing wouldn't come into it, would it be any better, or is it because it's classified as an affordable? Looking at it?
If I can perhaps answer that, Chair.
Sorry, John. Yeah.
It allows me to make another point too. It would be a more straightforward refusal, actually, William, because we don't approve new build houses on these sorts of sites unless they are affordable houses for local need. So that wouldn't overcome the problem. I think perhaps an important point as well, which I wanted to add on the back of that, is if the applicant's circumstances change at a future date, I guess they've got two options. They may change in a way that means she actually moves elsewhere, work or whatever, or if she needs a larger house, she can extend, apply to extend up to the threshold we have anyway. So it isn't a case of if we approve it at this size, it has to stay that size forever. There's always a possibility of an extension at a later date when circumstances change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, I seem to recall that, Patrick, you proposed a deferral for this initially. Is that correct?
Sorry, Chair. What we've got on the floor at the moment is we've got Councillor McCloy moved the refusal, but I didn't have a move to defer. So I think we're looking for, we've got the refusal on the table, whether somebody's prepared to second that. That's my reading of the meeting.
Second that, Chair.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. That is seconded then. So the motion to support the recommendation for refusal is on the floor.
And with respect, I moved first that it should be deferred.
Sorry, Patrick.
Sorry, Councillor Brady. I didn't hear if you did move it. I know you mentioned a deferral, but I didn't hear you actually formally move it. So apologies if
I moved it to deferral. Enable the issue of the house size to be sorted out.
well, I mean, nobody seconded anything then. So, I mean, at the moment, we've got two proposals that have been moved on the table. We'll have to deal with them as and when they've been seconded and dealt with. I didn't hear, Patrick, you moving a deferral.
I'll second Patrick.
So I've got seconders for both motions at the moment.
Excuse me again, Chair. I wonder if I could ask the question of the deferral, really. Exactly what are we expecting to happen? Because I think three things would need to happen. One, I think we'd expect in that deferral, as officers, we'd want to see the archaeological work done, because what's the point of a deferral otherwise on that count? On the highway points, I don't think there's anything that can be done there, so we either accept the Highway Authority view or we don't. It's a black and white choice, I think. And on the third point about the size of the dwelling, are we asking the applicant to make the house smaller? Because if we're accepting the house at the size it is now, I think that's an approval, not a deferral. If you're asking for a deferral, are you wanting officers to go back and somehow negotiate on the size of the house to make it smaller than it is now, but maybe bigger than the figure that's in policy? I think as officers, we need to know exactly what you're expecting us to achieve in a deferral. Thank you.
Thank you. So, William, what would you expect from a deferral?
I think officers should go along and speak to the applicant and see where the common ground is on this one. I'm not 100% happy with the highways thing, although in my experience in the planning department, they don't usually come up with an answer for turning it down. But it is it's a used access at the moment. So I think you'd be on sticky ground there. And it's like I said earlier, if you take it to a field, I think you could easily lose this because they approved an agricultural building.
Yeah, I think they are very different circumstances. And Mark Nuttall, I think, can explain how we've got to where we are, because it's application number 2. This isn't it, Mark? There has been engagement. So if Mark can perhaps explain that thing.
That's right, and that's really all I just wanted to say. The application that's in now, other than the design of the house, is identical to the one that was in almost 12 months ago. At that time, the issue of the size, the issue of the archaeology, and the highways issues were all made by both ourselves and the Highway Authority to the applicant. The applicant has since tried to work with the Highway Authority, and obviously their comments remain the same. There's been no movement on the archaeology, and the size of the property remains much, much larger than we can support. The applicant is aware that that's the case, because I've told them that on more than one occasion now, but this is what they want us to make a decision on. So I'm not sure that deferring the further discussion is going to move things. I think we're coming back with largely the same proposal in a month or two's time. That's my view.
Thank you, Mark. And the other thing we should remember is that in the past we've been critical of highways for not offering any comment on various planning applications. We do have quite detailed comment on this one, so they're the experts on highways, not us. Ken Richardson.
Chair, you've got 2 proposals now on the table. Can we move progress and take it to the vote? Because if people vote to refuse it, then there's no discussion about deferment or what's in the detail of that. I think it's been round the houses this morning.
I think you're right, Ken. Yes. I'm just concerned where we go now. So
it's the motion first, which has to be voted on.
So the proposal was for deferral, which came in first. So can I ask Alden House to take a vote on a proposal for deferral of this motion?
Okay, thank you, Chair. So, members, I'll go down the list, and if you can let me know if you are for, against, or abstaining from deferral of the motion in front on this report. Councillor Armitage?
For.
Councillor Brady? Councillor Chaplin?
Against.
Ms Harling?
Against.
Councillor Hart?
Against.
Mr Helliwell?
Against.
Councillor Huddleston?
Against.
Councillor McCloy?
Against.
Councillor Potter?
For.
Councillor Richardson?
Against.
Ms Slack?
Abstain.
Mr Smith?
Against.
And Councillor Warmby?
Abstain.
Thank you. So, Chair, we've got 3 for deferrals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 against deferral, and 2 abstains.
Thank you, Karen. So that motion is defeated. So we now have another motion, which is that the the recommendation for refusal be accepted. That's been proposed and seconded. So can I ask Karen again if you could take a vote on refusal of the motion, please?
Thank you, Chair. Again, members, I'll go down the list. If you could tell me if you're for the proposal, against the proposal, or you're abstaining, please. Councillor Armitage?
Against.
Councillor Brady?
Councillor Chaplin.
For.
Ms Harling.
For.
Councillor Hart.
Abstain.
Mr Helliwell.
For.
Councillor Huddleston.
For.
Councillor McCloy.
For.
Councillor Potter.
Recorded against, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Richardson.
For refusal.
Ms Slack.
Against.
Mr Smith.
For.
And Councillor Warmby.
Against.
Thank you. So, Chair, we've got 7 for the proposal, 5 against, and 1 abstain.
Thank you, Karen. So that motion is carried. Thank you. So we move on now to item 5, which is a full application for the removal of an exit. Sorry, I should have said, let's go back. We will now take 5 minutes break, 10 minutes break. So if you could be back at 11:25, please.
I've just had an hour and 10 minutes break.
Sorry, David. I hope everybody's suitably refreshed in my haste to try and get the meeting progressing. I omitted to mention a break. So we now move on to item 6, which is a full application for the removal of an existing shared septic tank and system and replaced with a shared sewage treatment plant. And this is at Clough Head Farm on the Worslow estate. So again, it's Mark that's going to take us through this one, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just wait for the slides. Great. Okay. So to the report, and that's that we've received a consultation response from Natural England now, who raised no objections to the proposals. So the application itself is at the authority-owned properties of Clough Head Farm and Clough Head Cottage. As you can see here, they're located in open countryside, and the site is approximately half a mile northwest of Worslow. Next slide, please. So this isn't a particularly clear plan on this screen, but this essentially just outlines the application site area in red. Just a bolder line that you can see to the bottom of the slide there is the road, and then you can see a sort of a smaller line winding up towards the 2 properties, and that's the site access. Next slide, please. So here's a closer up view of the site. So up at the top there, just sort of cropped out of the shop, that's Clough Head Farm. And at the bottom of the picture there, you can see Clough Head Cottage. And so this is the existing arrangement at the moment. Each property is served by a separate septic tank with a link between that at Clough Head Cottage and that at Clough Head Farm, which essentially is a overflow as I understand it. Next slide, please. And this shows the proposed arrangement. So the 2 properties would be served by a single package treatment plant. And as you'll see in the photos in a minute, the topography of the land means that the underground waste pipe can flow downhill from Clough Head Cottage down to the tank, which will be sited at Clough Head Farm. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is Clough Head Farm. That's the house there. Next slide, please. And that's looking back up the hill towards Clough Head Cottage. So you can see there's a sizable slope on the land, so that will work to allow the 2 to share the same tank. Next slide, please. And then just to the left of the shot there, that's Clough Head Farm again, with some outbuildings to the right, just to try and give you some orientation, because the next slide, if we can just go to that, shows the position of where the package treatment plant would be. So that's just behind those outbuildings you saw in the previous slide. All you'd be able to see there is the lid, essentially, or the cover to the tank, as the rest would be undergrounded. I don't know if there are any more photos. Can we go to the next slide? Oh yeah, and that's just an example of of what the tank looks like. The parts in front aren't actually part of this proposal. They're for reed bed installations, which isn't proposed here, but the picture behind is the tank. And if we just go to the final slide, then there you can see that just shows everything sort of against the soil is below the ground, with just the lid of the package treatment plant projecting above it. So in terms of the merits of the application, the visual impacts of the development are obviously very low, because almost the entirety of it is set below ground. Obviously excavation will be required. We've got no evidence of archaeological significance in this site, and nothing suggests that the site is highly significant or potentially highly significant, and the archaeologist has raised no objection or not recommend any conditions in relation to the excavation works. Whilst the plant would require some electricity to run, it would remove the risk of any untreated waste overflowing from the septic tanks that can occur at the moment, and it also remove the need for tankers to visit the site to empty the tanks. The way the package treatment plant works, it essentially breaks everything down and returns treated water into the groundwater, rather than just filling up and requiring emptying. So that removes the need for those tanker visits as well. So overall, they therefore represent an environmental improvement, and the development complies with planning policy, and it's recommended for approval. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. There are no speakers on this, so it's over to members for any questions and any comments, please. Andrew McCloy.
Chair, purely to move recommendation of approval. It all seems very sensible. I think we should back this. Thank you.
Thank you. Kath? Sorry, Kath?
Thank you, Chair. Is this application as a result of the 2022 new regulations on septic tanks?
Mark, can you answer that?
No, it isn't. It's come up. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback. I think somebody else's microphone's still turned on. Oh, thank you. That's better. No, planning permission is always required for the installation of a package treatment plant or a septic tank. In this case, the septic tanks are, according to the application, they're needing a lot of maintenance, and obviously they need emptying as well. So there's costs associated with that, and they don't work as effectively as a much more modern package treatment plant would, and that's why the application has come in. In terms of the planning guidance in relation to septic tanks and package treatment plants, it's a sequential approach. So wherever possible, any new drainage should connect to mains drainage. Where that's not possible, package treatment plants can be supported, and only where there's no scope at all to connect to those, which would effectively be somewhere where perhaps there's no way of connecting electricity supply to a package treatment plant. In those circumstances, septic tanks can still be supported.
Thank you, Mark. William?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to second the motion.
Thank you, William. Any further comments, questions? We have a motion on the floor, which is to support the recommendation. It's been proposed and seconded. So I'll go over to Alden House and ask for a vote to be taken, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So members, I'll go down the list. If you could just let me know if you're for, against or abstaining from the recommendation in the report, please. Councillor Armitage.
For.
Councillor Brady. Councillor Chaplin.
For.
Councillor Chapman.
For.
Ms Harling.
For.
Councillor Hart.
Can't unmute. For.
Thank you. Mr Helliwell.
For.
Councillor Huddleston.
For.
Councillor McCloy.
For.
Councillor Potter.
For.
Councillor Richardson.
For.
Ms Slack.
For.
Mr Smith.
For.
And Councillor Hornby.
For.
Thank you. That's unanimous, Chair.
Thank you very much. So we move on now to item 7, which is a similar application. It's removal of existing shared septic tank system and replacement with a shared sewage treatment plant at Wood Cottage, Leek Road, Longner. Again, Mark's department. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Just for clarity, this tank isn't shared at the moment, or isn't proposed to be. It's just a tank serving a single property and would remain so. So, as with the last application, there's been one update since the report was written, and that's the response from Natural England raising no objections. So the application site is shown here. It's the authority-owned property of Wood Cottage, and it's located again in open countryside, this time approximately 3/4 of a mile west of Longner. If we could have the next slide, please. So there's the application site. It's adjacent to the main road, and you can see there's a short driveway leading back to the property, and you can just about see there a sort of a red dotted line leading from the property itself to a septic tank towards the north of the application site area. Next slide, please. There you go. There's just a closer view of that. So you can see the property itself, Wood Cottage. There's a range of outbuildings next to that, and then the current septic tank is positioned some way from the property down the hill. Next slide, thank you. This is taken as a slightly different position of shot, but again, you can see Wood Cottage at the bottom of the screen there, and this shows where the proposed sewage treatment plant would go. So it's further up the field than on the last application, and the hatched area just shows where the outflow from the package treatment plant would run into. Next slide, please. So that's the property from the front. So the house itself is to the right there, with the outbuildings to the left. And this shows the property from the side. So the package treatment plant would be roughly behind that blue car that you can see there, probably about where the sort of the tufts of grass are in front of it. Again, it would be below ground as the last one was. Next slide, please. And that's just showing the view from pretty much the same position, but looking down the field. So that's the area that's proposed to use to soak away, essentially. And just the next slide and the final one, please. So yeah, you can see it's exactly the same system as proposed previously. Incidentally, the sizes between the two are different because this one is smaller because it would be serving only a single dwelling, whereas the last one was obviously serving 2 dwellings, and so that was proposed to be a larger one. So the impacts here really and the considerations are the same as they were on the last application. Again, the visual impacts of the development are going to be very low. There's been no archaeological constraints identified, and there's no archaeological mitigation deemed to be required here. It would again require some electricity to run, but it would remove the risk of overflow and pollution from a septic tank, which can occur at the moment, as well as the need for the site to be visited by tankers to empty a septic tank. And again, we conclude that it represents an environmental improvement and complies with policy, and it's therefore recommended for approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Again, no speakers on this one. So any questions and comments? Andrew McCloy, David Chapman.
I'll move this again. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. David, I think I missed you previously.
Yeah, you did. I'll send it, Chair, and I look forward to seeing a lush growth of green grass next time I drive past the site.
Thank you. William?
Yeah, it's just one thing. What happens when there's a power cut? Does raw sewage go straight through it?
That's a very good question. Can you answer that, Mark?
Not from a position of knowledge, but I'd anticipate that a power cut would have to be going on for a long time because it's a large tank, and so it's not when something goes into it, waste and water, it doesn't flow straight through and just come out the other side. It sits in there for quite some time, settles, and then it comes out more gradually at the other side as treated water. So you'd have to have a power cut over quite a long period of time, as I understand it, for that to have any effect on the output.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. If there are no further questions or comments, can we go to Alden House for a vote then, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. So members, again, I'll be asking you individually if you are for, against or abstaining from the recommendation in the report. Councillor Armitage.
For.
Councillor Brady.
For.
Councillor Chaplin.
For.
Councillor Chapman.
For.
Ms Harling.
For.
Councillor Hart.
For.
Mr Hellwell.
For.
Councillor Huddleston.
For.
Councillor McCloy.
For.
Councillor Potter.
For.
Councillor Richardson.
For.
Ms Slack.
For.
Mr Smith.
For.
Councillor Warmby.
For.
Thank you. That's unanimous, Chair.
Thank you very much. So if we now move on to item 8, which is the monitoring and enforcement quarterly review, and it's over to Andrew Cook. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Morning to everyone and a Happy New Year. Hopefully it's not too late to wish you a Happy New Year. Yeah, this is the standard quarterly report for the monitoring enforcement team, which summarises what we've been up to over the last quarter. So this runs this report up to the end of last year. So it covers October, November and December. If I can take you straight to paragraph 5, which lists the cases where we've issued enforcement notices or formal notices in the last quarter. And the first slide there is the first of those cases. We've got photographs of each of these cases to just give you an idea of the types of cases where we're issuing enforcement notices. So the first one, as the slide says, is a site near Glossop up on Coombs Tor, which is a very prominent site, as hopefully you can gather from the photograph, very wide panoramic views from this particular site. And the development, as should be obvious from the photograph, hopefully is the erection of a mast on the top of this exposed edge and associated apparatus attached to it. The enforcement notice was issued in October, as the report says, and it came into effect on the 27th of November, so we didn't receive an appeal. Just to give you a bit of a backstory to this this enforcement notice, the reason we've chosen to issue the enforcement notice is that the development was getting close to becoming immune. As members will hopefully understand, there are certain periods after which development becomes immune from enforcement action and essentially lawful, and after that date we can't take enforcement action against it. In this case, it's classed as a building operation and the relevant period is 4 years. So it was getting relatively close to that 4-year period, hence, as I say, the reason we issued the enforcement notice. The other thing to say about this is that the apparatus is providing a broadband service to the local residents in this area, which is something that generally, obviously, we want to encourage and support. And we have been discussing with the people responsible for it some alternative provision. So we are having ongoing discussions with them about that. And you'll see from the report that the compliance dates that we've given in the enforcement notice for removal of the development are very generous. We've given them a year to comply with the enforcement notice, and this is to allow for those discussions and negotiations to continue. And we are very hopeful that we can come to some resolution that will provide or maintain the broadband provision that these people currently enjoy in the local area, but will provide it in a much more appropriate way than is currently the case. So hopefully that one will be resolved without having to follow through, if you like, on the enforcement notice. If we can move on to the second slide, please. So this is Home Farm at Sheldon. As you'll see from the report, we've issued 2 notices here. We did previously issue, and I think this was reported in the last report back in October, we did issue a temporary stop notice against this development. So this is the building work that you can see, which is at the rear of the main building to the left of the photograph, which is used as a guest house. Obviously you can see the building work is fairly substantial. There's been quite a lot of excavations taking place, and obviously walls have started to be built, etc. So we, as I say, did a temporary stop notice back in September. That temporary stop notice only lasts for 28 days, and within that time we then have to decide whether to take any further action. The temporary stop notice had the desired effect. It did cease, the owner did cease the work. So when we came towards the end of that 28 days, as I say, we had to assess whether to take any further action. We were concerned that the owner might carry on with the work once the temporary stop notice ceased to have effect. So, as the report states, we issued a stop notice on the 16th of October alongside an enforcement notice. So the stop notice has effect permanently until permission is granted or an appeal is allowed, for example, against the enforcement notice. But the stop notice is a permanent notice. The enforcement notice requires the work or the development that's been carried out so far to be removed. We have received an appeal since the report was written. We have received an appeal which has been registered by the Planning Inspectorate against the enforcement notice. So the enforcement notice hasn't yet come into effect. Whether it will obviously depend on the outcome of the appeal. The appeal is being determined by written representations. If we can just move on to the next slide, please. So this is the next site listed, which is land at 5 Acre Field near Longner. I hope you'll all agree, a fairly unattractive building, which we understand is used for storage and also as a workshop and for welfare purposes. But as you can see, it's certainly not a design of building that we'd be wanting to approve in any circumstances, really. And the need for the building for agricultural purposes is certainly not been demonstrated. So we've issued an enforcement notice in October. In this case, we haven't received an appeal, so the notice came into effect on the 11th of December, and the compliance dates are, as you can see in the report, 11th of April for the removal of the building, and also 11th of May for the removal of materials. I think some of the materials you can see in that photograph just in front of and to the right of the building. And if we move on to the next photograph, I think we can see some of the other items that are stored on the land, tipped on the land, however you want to describe it. So yeah, the enforcement notice requires those to be removed, as well as the building. Okay, so those are the sites where we've issued notices in the last quarter. If we move on to section 6 of the report, this is a list of the cases, as per usual, where we've resolved enforcement cases. And again, we've got some photographs to show some of those cases where breaches have been resolved. So this is the first one on the list, which is Heathydale at Tideswell. So this is a residential property. You can just see the bungalow in the distance behind the tree, and the land between the wall, which is on the roadside, and the property. Obviously, this is the before photograph, which shows that there was some work taking place on the land, and we understood that the land was proposed to be changed to become part of the curtilage. It was previously agricultural land. So if we move on to the next photograph, we'll see that through negotiation, we've now got that situation where the land has been restored and is now back to basically part of the field. So that use that was being proposed as garden has ceased. Move on to the next slide, please. This is the Swan Inn at Kettlesholm, as the slide says. And look at the next slide.
I think we've lost you altogether, Andrew.
Video and see if that makes a difference. Is that better?
That's better, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so this is the Swan Inn at previous slide showed the stainless steel flue. This photo, yeah, thank you. And then on to the next one. This different viewpoint. Thanks. This is taken from a different viewpoint. The flue was just side of this picture. You can see where just to the right hand side, and there's a chimney, the single story building towards the right hand side of the photograph. That's where the flue was, but it's now been removed. Okay, if we can move on to the next one, please. Thank you. This is at Eam. It was non-compliance with a condition. Planning permission was granted some years ago to extend the car park at the doctor's surgery in Eam. So although the site addresses the rectory, the application was in respect of the health centre, the doctor's surgery, as I say, to extend the car park into the land that was previously part of the rectory. The issue with breach of condition was in relation to the wall that you can see, the retaining wall at the back of the extended car park. There was a condition requiring that to be faced with stone. This is within the conservation area. It's also relatively close to listed buildings. So obviously the design of the development and particularly the materials used were particularly important, hence the condition requiring the wall to be faced with stone. But when it was constructed and for quite a while afterwards, it was in the state that you can see there. But if we move on to the next photograph, we can see that the wall has now been faced, which gives a much better appearance. I hope you all agree. I think that might be the last one, unless we've got one more case. Yeah, sorry, this is the last one. So this is right up in the close to the northern boundary of the national park, up at Diggle near Saddleworth. And it's a property which is part of the Diggle Mill complex, for those that know it. It's the old mill house associated with Diggle Mill. And this is the land adjoining the property, where you can see that there was a significant amount of waste material, household waste and excavated material that had been tipped on the land adjacent to this property. And if we look at the next photograph, that's another example of the sort of material that was on the land previously. And then I think the next photograph shows the land having been cleared. So yeah, there you can see. So this is as I say, it's part of a complex of properties, previously Diggle Mill, which has been converted into a number of dwellings now some years ago. And it's relatively prominent in the local area, seen from public footpaths and from the access to the Diggle Mill site itself. So it was viewed as quite important to get this site tidied, and obviously we've had a good result there. So just briefly then to move on to the last part of the report, which just summarises the workload and performance of the team at the end of last quarter, and also summarises our performance on our two main performance targets. So our main performance target for the year is to resolve 150 breaches of planning control. In the last report to committee in October, I set out the circumstances in relation to various vacancies in the team, and also the difficulties that we've had to work under in relation to the COVID-19 restrictions and so on. And as a result of that, we are going to struggle, we think, to meet our performance target this year. But it's particularly pleasing that this last quarter we have closed 36 enforcement cases. In the previous 2 quarters, we resolved 40 breaches in total. So we have done particularly well in the last quarter. And as a result of that, the number of cases overall has gone down slightly. It's still obviously a very high figure. So if you look at the table at the bottom of the report, the bottom right figure there, the outstanding breaches, previous quarter was 670, and it's now gone down to 665. And that's partly because we've resolved so many cases in the last quarter. In terms of inquiries, again, we're also doing relatively well in the circumstances we're in, and we've only just missed our target in the last quarter, which is to investigate inquiries within 30 working days. We have a target of 80%, and we achieved 77%, which I think, as I say, in the circumstances is a really good result. I think that's it, Chairman. Thank you very much. If there's any questions or comments.
Thank you, Andrew. Patrick, I see you got your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the report, Andrew. Some very good news in that. It's this last point that you were making that I'd just like to explore a bit further. this figure of outstanding of 665, what would that have been, say, last year? I don't remember a figure as high as this at all, but I might be mistaken. I don't want an exact figure, but an approximate figure.
I think it is obviously very high. I think it has been going up relatively slowly but continuously for the last 3 or 4 years, I would say. I would think probably a year ago, I mean, I could probably get the figure for you if you needed it, but I would suggest it'd probably be around about 600, maybe a year ago.
Yeah, or even less. I don't remember reading one as high as that before. We had this discussion 3 months ago when we had your annual report, and this issue about staff shortages and things came up. Has anything developed since then in terms of trying to help you meet these targets? Or should I be directing that question at John Scott?
Probably best to address it to John, yeah.
So John. Yeah, I was about to suggest perhaps I could answer that. Answering your previous question, I had a figure in my head, albeit quite a few years out of date now, but I think in the first few years of me being in this job, so let's say 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was in the 400s, Andrew, the number of cases. So, yep,
yeah, that was my impression.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the vacancy, the key vacancy is the South Area Monitoring and Enforcement Officer, the person who goes around and investigates complaints, etc., and inquiries. In effect, that post has been vacant for the best part of a year. The previous post holder wasn't at work for the first 3 months of this last year, 2020, so it was vacant. Then we had difficulties trying to fill the post during the summer period. And then since September, the post was held open because we knew we'd be making people redundant as part of the recent restructure. And it was unfortunate we had to do that because I think this is, it's an important post. It may not be the highest paid post in the organisation, but it's a very important post. But we held it open whilst we were going through the restructure on the basis we might be able to offer it to somebody who was being made redundant. We expect that position to be clarified within this month, I think, to be honest. And the post will either be filled or it will be re-advertised. We've had some help from another member of the team, so it hasn't been 100% vacancy. Fiona Todd has been doing some work in addition to the planning liaison officer work that she does. So I think if you bear in mind the team has had a vacancy for the best part of a year, I think the figures are particularly good. But I'd be very surprised if we don't resolve that either by filling it or advertising it within the next month. I'd be disappointed if we don't.
Forgive me. My memory is, I should have checked this beforehand. my memory is that it wasn't just one vacancy that was the problem. There was something else missing. Was there?
Sure. Yep. And
yeah,
worth explaining the position with the half the Joe Freeguard post as I think of it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but there are 2 other posts that are currently vacant. One of which is a permanent post, but half-time, so it'll be 2.5 days a week, and that was set up particularly to deal with listed building breaches. And that post has been vacant since I think it's April of last year.
Yeah, April.
Yeah, and another post that also became vacant at about the same time was a 2-year contract post, which had a year left to run, and that was for a senior monitoring enforcement officer dealing with some of the more high-profile cases. So, as John says, we are hopefully going to resolve the situation with the monitoring enforcement officer post in the near future, and then we will presumably be looking at the other posts as well.
Yeah, I'm about to say what I'm being told here is that even if you resolve that post in the near future, you've still got other posts that are vacant, and you'll still have difficulty meeting these targets. Is that what I'm being told?
Yeah. Again, if I can perhaps help on the half post, it's a post we need to re-advertise and get that one filled because that is on the establishment. That was paid for by the increase in planning application fees a couple of years ago. The other post, a 2-year post, where we had somebody in it for 1 year and he left at the start of lockdown in April. The post was paid for by underspend in the development management service. And we had a report to authority back in probably early September, I think it might have been, where we had to take any unspent reserves in order to have a reserve for COVID. So the money that we're paying for that post, a temporary post, has now gone because it got swept into the COVID reserve along with a lot of other monies. But the half post is a post which is on the establishment still and is funded, so we need to get that one filled.
Well,
Thank you.
Well, the question is the other way around then, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have a target of whatever the target is that we expect to perform. We attach a lot of importance to that target because planning enforcement is very important. The question is, are we resourced to meet that target? Or does the target need to be reviewed in some way?
Good point, Patrick.
And I think that's something that in his role as head of planning now, I think Brian, can work with Andrew to look at that target. In terms of the resource, I've often said that if every post which we had on the establishment was filled and everyone was fit and healthy, we'd be adequately resourced. You can always make a case for more, but in the overall constraints of local government and National Park Authority funding, we're adequately resourced. If the posts are filled, that's been the problem we've had.
Yeah.
So it's important we do fill those posts. The past few months of uncertainty have been very unhelpful in that respect. I think what Brian and Andrew need to do now, because Andrew will be working to Brian, is to have a look at those targets, because we think if they're realistic with the resources we've got.
If I can just briefly come in just to explain a bit of background as well in just historical context just over the last year or so. If we wind back a year, we had a full complement of staff. Obviously COVID wasn't known about a year ago. So the position we were in a year ago, we were looking then at our target, and we'd actually met, I think we'd exceeded our target by some way with a full complement of staff at that time. And our target for the previous year had been 120 breaches resolved. So in the position we were in a year ago with a full complement, having met that target and exceeded it, we actually increased our target from 120 to 150. As I say, what's happened has happened since then. We've had the vacancies, people have moved on for various reasons. We've not been able to fill them, and we've obviously also had the situation with the pandemic. So in retrospect, we kind of cut our nose off despite our face by increasing our target, but at the time we felt that it was an appropriate thing to do. As John said, we'll now need to probably sit down with Brian and reassess that in the light of the resources we currently have.
Thank you, Andrew. I've got 3 more speakers on here. We've got David Chapman, William and Andrew McCloy. I've got David first. He got his hand up first, sorry.
Thanks, Chair. I think it's worth making a couple of points, particularly for members who are newer to enforcement. That this authority, unlike quite a lot of LPAs and local authorities, actually takes enquiries from people calling in anonymously. So we look at, and I think Andrew, you'll confirm this, we look at every enquiry, which really is the right thing to do, because an anonymous enquiry can have the same effect as somebody who's not anonymous. But that does mean that we're open to taking lots and lots of enquiries where people maybe aren't always, shall we say, ethical in their inquiries stroke complaints. The other point is, and you've seen this to a small extent on the cases that Andrew has pointed out, is that there are many ways of stalling enforcement notices. There are appeals. There are changes of planning. There are these. I think. I mean, Andrew, you can answer this, but it's possible to extend these enforcement notices for years in some cases, isn't it? You know, just the kind of stumbling blocks that people can shove in your way to stall it and to impede it. So I think I mean, whether we change this, I don't know. I personally wouldn't like to see the anonymous thing changing, because it is important for us to be notified. But this is just a couple of the ways in which our enforcement team are up against it. And I commend you for the work you do, Andrew.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I'll pass that on.
Thank you, David. Can I go to Andrew McCloy, who's... Sorry. Can I go to Andrew McCloy, who's championing a bit?
Robert, thank you. I'll keep this really brief. I agree with David Chapman. Andrew Cook's team deserve a lot of praise for working, as the rest of the planning service have done, in difficult circumstances and bringing the targets down. But let's just face up to one or two facts. 665 outstanding breaches is too much. It needs to come down. Long-standing vacancies, as in long-standing vacancies, are unacceptable. We need to fill them. If we can't fill them, what's the problem there? That needs to be looked at. And we need to set ourselves stretching targets. You know, well done to Andrew and his team for going beyond and above. But, you know, I'd hope that we're all aiming to do that. And as John Scott said, I'm looking at Brian Taylor to sit down, have a good think, and with Andrew Cook, and work out what needs to be done here, given the resources and given the circumstances. So we are making progress, don't get me wrong, but let's not kid ourselves. There's a long way to go before we get it shipshape. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And can I go to William now, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We've got the same problem at North East. We've been without enforcement officers. We've had to bring people in from other authorities. And when it comes to experts on listed buildings, well, we've had to use an agency nearby to do it, and it is expensive. There are town and country courses available at universities, and people are crying out for jobs for new graduates. And surely, if you were to approach the universities who offer these courses, say, hey, you know, we've got all these courses, we've got these vacancies, can you help us out? It could be a way around. I realise that you have experience if they don't get a job.
Thank you, William. Thank you, everyone. Any further comments now? It doesn't actually say on the report. I think you're supposed to note it, are we, Andrea? Yeah. So is it just a case of
recommendation to note? Yeah.
It's just a case of show of hands. Yeah. So if you could all show your hands in acceptance of this, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Andrew for achieving quite a lot with limited resources over the last quarter.
Thank you.
Thanks to the team.
Just ask a question before. Can I just ask a question before we move on? If we're voting by a show of hands, what about all the people who aren't on video?
Good point, Andrea. Any comment? I mean, we've got two that aren't on video. Three.
Yeah, so this is a noting report. So rather than going through a roll call, what we do is we do it really by acceptance of the meeting, by showing their hands. If people aren't able to do that because they're not visible, then they would need to make themselves heard by their audio, and they would need to actually say whether or not they were going to vote against it, or they weren't happy with the content. But as I said, we're not making a decision here, we're noting a report.
Thank you, Andrea. Is that cleared that up, David? So the next one is the head of law report, which is also a report that we have to note. So is Brian or John taking that one? Neither.
No, I'm happy to mention it. I think maybe Brian, on the back of the briefing discussion we had earlier, in fact, would you like to have a few words on this, about the CC1 stuff in particular?
Yeah, okay. So skip to that one. So yeah, we've got the first part of the report is just the new appeals lodged, but if you skip to the second part, part 2, appeals decided, I was just looking at some of the issues in here, and particularly I think worthy of note are the two, one at Hayfield. So we've got rear facing first floor balcony with glass balustrade at 4 Bank Cottage, Hayfield. And overall, the inspector has considered that there's no harm to the character and appearance of the national park. So that was one issue. The location and orientation, obviously, of that development didn't cause harm. But we'd also raised issues about our policy CC1, and obviously over the last year or so, through validation and pushing of the policy, we've been trying to do as much as we can to up the kind of environmental credentials of development. A lot of that can come through pre-app, obviously, but then through the conditions we attached. And we've been looking really to push that as far as possible. It's just really interesting in this case, just to view what the inspector said about pushing that in the context of smaller development. So really he's talking about in his report that it's kind of disproportionate in the balance of benefits that he's looking at. He felt that wasn't strong enough to use that as a reason for refusal. So that's one issue, that he felt that scale of development wasn't enough to refuse it just on that point alone. The second point, just to carry on the theme of CC1, is this last one here, described as unmounted solar PV array at Blakelow Farm, Bonsall. So this is a field arrangement, ground versus what we often see, which is the use of PV on farm roofs, etc. And we have had permissions for these. We've had a permission, I think, in the Acre area where it was replacement for a wind turbine, going back a few years. But in this case, the inspector does refer quite heavily to our landscape information for that part of the national park, and puts a lot of weight on that. So we have to just bear in mind the fact that we're trying to be positive about as much rollout of renewable technology as possible across the national park, but it's very much about case by case and citing, and that through these kind of cases we do observe that some environments are better than others for that in terms of protecting the character of the national park. So dismissed on that basis, that the actual siting was too visible and impacted on the natural beauty of the national park. But quite good that he's referring the inspector in that point to the specifics of our landscape character guidance as well. So those are the main things I took from that. Just if there's any observations from the members.
Thank you, Andrew McCloy.
Yeah, my observation, Brian, is that I appreciate that the inspector dismissed the ground-mounted solar PV array at Blakelow Farm, Bonsall, but I also know it was a delegated decision. Why didn't that come to committee, given the nature of it and high profile, the issues around CC1? I would have expected that to come to members.
John, do you know on that one for me?
Yeah, on the present standing orders, although if I think back, Andrew, to early this summer when we had that approach agreed where, I can't think how I described it, almost like an early warning system, having our radar on about the things you may be interested in as members. It was one of those where, with the responses we had from consultees and a very clear officer view, it could be dealt with under delegated powers. I think on the back of the discussion we had earlier this summer, which I think a lot of members perhaps aren't aware of, we had an application elsewhere in the park which raised issues which at the time we thought weren't significant, but with hindsight it was the sort of application that perhaps should have come to members. It could have been dealt with under delegated powers. So what we agreed with the chair and vice chair, deputy chair, and the chairs of the committees, I think, was that we would be a bit more flexible about how we use standing orders and delegated powers and bring things to committee where we thought they raised wider issues. I think with the scale of this one and the very clear recommendation, I don't think we thought it was appropriate to bring it to committee, but because that would mean bringing almost every application for renewables to committee. Now, if that needs to change, we can look at standing orders again. We've had another one refused recently over in the Dane Valley. I walked past the site when I was on leave this week, a very, very open site, again for ground-mounted solar panels, very clear refusal, which I think would have been wasting the committee's time to bring it here, even though it was solar panels, which in principle we should be trying to support renewable energy. So a fairly long-winded way of saying we can look at standing orders again, or I think more appropriately, officers just be aware when there's something significant that we could refuse on the delegated powers, maybe come to committee with it.
May I just briefly come back? Thank you, John. I know Brian is noting this conversation. I really do think, given climate change leadership is a key strategic aim for us as a national park and as a national park family, that we should think very carefully in terms of our climate change policies and looking for opportunities to promote sympathetic development. And I accept some will not be suitable, but it's a judgment call, and where it is finely balanced, it has to come to members, regardless of whether or not in the end the inspector agrees with us or not. So I think there's something we need to bear in mind there. And separately from this, can I just ask in a minute for an update on the Mid-Hope Law inquiry as well, please, where we are with that? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Brian's got his hand up. Do you want to come in on that?
Just, I should have said really that as part of collecting information on appeals, the policy team will be doing some appeals monitoring of that as well. So that's about just looking at the issues being raised. It is very much in our minds to push on further with our climate change policies and to use cases like this. When you see decisions like this from inspectors, you start to think, well, actually, do we need a different kind of evidence base? Do we need to present a different context to push further on those smaller schemes? Because you can see what's happening now. So actually, as a national park with this circular kind of context, that we should be exemplars for environmental development, we should be pushing further, and that renewables should be the norm. We need to create that policy context for that. So it is, I'm just seeing it as quite helpful at the minute, just to kind of drive, the fact that we need to be in a different place. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. And John, can we come to you for just an update on the Mid-Hope situation, please?
Yeah, thank you. As you may recall, the inquiry was going to be held back in early December, but there was I think an issue with our barrister led to it being postponed. And we now have a date in the diary for the 23rd of February. I'm just trying to remember, Andrew, whether that's been confirmed. The other side were asking for it to be sometime in June, which is way off. Yeah. And if you go back to what Andrew Cook was saying earlier, it's Andrew can perhaps answer this. Andrew was explaining earlier in response to, I think, David's question about how you can, when a notice has been served, it can take an awful long while. We served this notice 2.25 years ago. Andrew, do you have an update on the inquiry date?
Yeah, as you say, we had an issue with our barrister, so he couldn't attend the planned inquiry in December at the last minute. So it had to be postponed. There was no alternative, unfortunately. The date of the 23rd of February was offered by the planning inspectorate, but the appellant can't make that date. So at the moment, we're still not sure when that date will be, but it certainly won't be February. It will be later in the year. So we're still currently waiting. We've provided our availability. The appellant side have provided their availability over the next few months, and we're waiting for a date to be suggested. Another date to be suggested by planning inspectorate.
Okay. Sorry, can I'm at the risk of stating the obvious, Andrew and John here. The longer we leave this, or the longer this drags on, the more the implications for the track on the ground and the circumstances are changing already. You know, two plus years on, if the inspector goes up there and has another look, that track will look very different. The implications for taking it up again are going to be even more profound. It's this dragging on is not doing anyone any favours.
No, absolutely not. Early last year, I wrote to the chief inspector to say at that point we're well over 1 year after the notice has been served, about a year and a half, and I said to her, I'm really concerned about this. It's a high-profile enforcement case. Why is it taking so long to organise the inquiry? And here we are, about 1 year on, and we still don't know what the date's going to be. We are very much in the planning inspectorate's hands. On the ground, Andrew, it's interesting to see what's happening, and I think Andrew Cook might, well, hopefully will agree with this. I think we're seeing two things. The bits of the track which have worked okay, because the ground is maybe more stable. It isn't breaking up. We've got vegetation coming back in, albeit grass rather than heather. The bits which haven't performed well are simply getting worse. So it would be difficult for an inspector to accept the whole thing in its entirety, which is what the appeal is asking for. So in some bits, absolutely yes. It's becoming better covered with vegetation, but in other bits, it's simply getting worse.
Yeah, I'd agree with that assessment. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. William, your hand is up.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at this report, we've got there was one of the appeals was allowed, and going back to the last article, you're talking about barristers and things like that. What sort of, if we get costs awarded, what sort of figure are we looking at? What sort of figure have we had awarded against us as regards costs?
No idea.
I can, yeah. Unfortunately,
John?
I do. Yeah, unfortunately, I do know because I had to answer this question recently. Someone was doing an FOI request, asking for costs. I've been doing this job for roughly 8 years, 8 and a bit years now, and so I was able to report the cases I was aware of. There was one just prior to that, I think. But in the last 8 years, we've had a case in Baslow, at what is now the Co-op, where there was a refusal, I think against officer recommendation, if you don't mind me saying, and we paid about £9,000 in costs there. We had a case at Bank House in Hathersage, and we paid about £11,000 in costs. The figures are in the public domain, so I don't mind saying this online. And then we had another case where the costs were about £500 at Earl Sterndale, not very much. What we haven't had, William, if I think about the North East Derbyshire case, because I know you've had some big cases over there, we haven't had any significant costs in the many tens of thousands, which you often hear elsewhere. In the Mid-Hunt Moor case, the other side have threatened costs, but I think we've got a strong case. We have a case for claiming costs against them. So it isn't tit for tat. You have to choose your case. But if we've acted reasonably, and we have, I think, in the Mid-Hunt Moor case, even if we lose, we shouldn't have to pay costs. You only pay costs if you're unreasonable, and the unreasonability has incurred extra costs for the other side. Simply losing isn't enough to pay costs. It has to be unreasonable. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you've got a
No further comments. So if no further comments, this report is to be noted. So those that I can see, would you like to raise your hands if you're in favour of this, please? That's everyone I can see there. Thank you. And that's the last item on the agenda for this morning. So thank you very much. Thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you all in February. Thank you.
Has Robert gone?